Sorry. Buen día, estás escuchando Encuentros Políticos. You're listening to Political Encounters on USALA Radio, a show focused on discussing political issues and taking action in Philadelphia's Latinx communities and beyond. I'm Edwin Mayorga, PhD. Today's episode is titled Higher Education Futuros under the Biden-Harris Administration. As we shift in transition into a new presidential presidency, we are thinking about a number of different aspects of higher education, or I'm sorry, education policy and social policy, and what leadership we will be looking towards. And so today we're focusing on higher education, and I'm pleased to have several guests speaking. And today in today's conversation, I'll be talking through or just introducing each of them very briefly, and then we'll jump into some questions today and looking forward to the conversation. So first I have Dr. Adrián Huerta, who's an assistant professor of education in the Palias Center for Higher Education at the University of Southern California. I'm also joined by Dr. Susana Munoz, who's an associate professor of higher education, program coordinator of the Higher Education Leadership Program, and co-director of CSU's initiatives for the Race and Intersectional Studies for Educational Equity, or RISE Center in the School of Education at Colorado State University. Dr. Blanca Elizabeth Vega is a native New Yorker and the daughter of Ecuadorian immigrants, and is currently an assistant professor of higher education at Montclair State University. And Dr. Jason Thomas Wozniak, who holds a PhD in philosophy and education, and is part of the Student Debt Collective, and currently teaching courses in higher education in the Educational Foundations and Policy Studies Department at Westchester University. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
So I wanted to begin by asking, and this is for all of you, feel free to chime in. So what is your sense of the state of higher education as we come to the end of the Trump presidency, in particular for BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color students?
So from my vantage point, oh, go ahead. So from my vantage point, students are tired. I think, this has been a long 4 years, but I think we also have to remember that this did not begin, sort of like the racial inequities that we experienced in the United States did not begin with the Trump administration. And it's not going to end with the Trump era. So I think that's one of the things that I know I've been talking a lot with students is sort of what's this new wave that's coming that's, unknown, or this continued civil, like that racial inequity and unrest that we're seeing on our streets and in our college campuses will look similar to what we sort of experienced in the last 4 years. I also think that there's mental health issues that I think was definitely that has not necessarily been addressed in the ways that when we have COVID and systemic and structural racism compounded together. I think that's one of the things that I've been seeing with students is sort of this exaggerated sense of mental health issues that they've been experiencing that are actually causing them to question, is this the right time for me to be in higher education right now? So that's sort of the sense that I get, from my vantage point. I'd be interested and love to hear the conversation from others.
Yeah, and if I could jump in as well, to build on that, I think there's dysfunction, but then also like anxiety and about what's happening. And when we start looking at resources and how staff, faculty, and students again are stretched, and I think have just hit their limits. And now we're entering a state of uncertainty where in the past you can say, once you graduate, especially in the last few years, once you graduate, there'll be a job, there'll be an internship, there'll be a chance for, some type of economic stability. And just, everyone in January, February felt confident about how things were moving, right? We heard about COVID, but we weren't sure what was happening. We knew that there was obviously dysfunction in the Department of Ed, in the US Department of Ed with policies and protections for, protected groups. But with COVID and Trump, that intersection, I think, has really just exposed all the vulnerabilities that Susana was mentioning, but then also like all these other things about the lack of social safety net and the additional pressures that higher ed as institutions are experiencing to now, house students, provide additional mental health, to focus on basic needs in a way that is really just exploded, because where else do students and families go, right? Like, we're in the past, even for example, student parents would depend on their community colleges for childcare, right? During the week so they can focus on their classes, and now that's gone. So really, like, I think if anything, we're everyone again depleted, relieved that there isn't a continuation of 4 more years of Trump and his failed policies, but also I think there's a sense of anxiety of like, okay, what is the Biden and Harris administration going to do? Because they have so many things to tackle in the first 100 days. So they really, hopefully, won't have any missteps because of the Senate's actions or inactions.
And I think Dr. Huerta and Dr. Munoz really laid it out pretty well in talking about like how Trump really broke a lot more things along the way, right? So where things were already broken, right? When I was teaching in 2017. Our finance class in higher education, students were saying, that they can't even get married because, they had a lot of student debt. So they came in already exhausted. They came in already, needing resources to support their livelihood, right? And then, Trump comes along and he continues to break those things. So, it's interesting that that the Biden-Harris administration really has to figure out, are they going to, pretty much, what choices they have to make? Because from what I'm reading, a lot of the the higher ed policies that they're talking about in terms of student loans is a lot more Band-Aids than there are fixing, right? I just, heard of a statistic. I think it was Citigroup who did some kind of research report on racial disparities in housing and how, just by eliminating structural racism, just for Black people, just for African Americans in the United States, could add about $5 trillion in the GDP. So imagine if we eliminate student debt for everyone. And now, of course, I read, all these policies will ultimately be in favor for those who are already economically well off. But to really level out the playing field, we have to stop talking about bandage policies. These Band-Aid policies that we continue, whether it's from the Obama administration, from whatever other administration, these Band-Aid policies, and I'm sure Dr. Waz will be able to talk more about this. I think it really needs to be thought through a little bit more to recover from the mental and this collective exhaustion that we're all feeling.
Yeah, I really appreciate the comments of everyone, and especially what Blanca was saying. As a member of the Death Collective, this is a priority for us. I guess I just want to say really quickly that I think we're in an apocalyptic moment for higher education, and by apocalyptic I mean going back to the Greek word apocalypse. It means to uncover and to reveal. And I think what's happening is COVID is uncovering and revealing the ways in which racial capitalism has impacted higher education since this country's beginning, but especially now. And we see this in many ways, but I do want to focus on 2 things. One being the student debt crisis that Blanca mentioned, but also there's a university debt crisis. In other words, there's an institutional debt crisis that universities face right now that is driving austerity. So when your universities are cutting faculty members, cutting programs, cutting pay for staff and others, you have to keep in mind, they're not cutting what they're paying creditors. Creditors are making millions upon millions on interest payments. And so this austerity that's being driven is driven by the institutional debt. That also has an impact on student debt that some of my colleagues at Salem State, Rich, Levy, and Joanna Gonzalez have showed the direct correlation. And this is all to say that this impacts BIPOC students the most, disproportionately. So a good colleague, Jalil Bishop from Philadelphia, that Edwin and I have the good fortune to know, has done amazing work in showing how this is really detrimental to the Black population here in Philadelphia and other places. So yeah, I think if we spend some time talking about the student debt crisis, but also the institutional debt crisis, because this is tied into the lack of higher education funding that has been cut for the last 40 years, you know, from Democratic and Republican state and federal governors and governing bodies. So I think we're all hitting on the heart of the matter here in this apocalyptic moment.
So it looks as though, I think as all of you have laid out, this isn't solely about the end of the Trump administration or the 4 years under Trump, but rather something much more systemic and ongoing with regards to the conditions in which higher education operates and functions, and what that specifically then means for the students. I'm curious as to what people's thoughts are then regarding the kind of ongoing push for everyone to be college and career ready. Are we just kind of selling? Is this a shell game that we are selling students or families, particularly vulnerable families? Just curious as to what you all think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see this in Latin American economies, right? We for years now, where a certain few are educated and choose education because of the lack of jobs that exist, right? And I think this is what, you know, we're about to embark on. I don't know if I necessarily agree that that students felt a little hopeful once they had a bachelor's degree. I don't think that has really been I haven't heard that from my students who I've worked with. A lot of them have been pushed to enter into graduate programs because of the lack of jobs, adding on to their debt. And so just to, become teachers, I was a financial aid counselor at Bank Street College, for example, which is a school of education, that at the time, had students, pay about $50,000, you know what I mean, for, a graduate school education to become teachers. And here we are, telling them that, school is everything, and they're really hopeful just to not find that, pot of gold. So but at the same time, saying that, education is important, for intellectual reasons is also unfair, right? I think that there's huge problems that, that we are at this current moment not even able to talk about because of the executive order, around, racial diversity and not being able to speak about these issues, which we know, studies have shown that this has been able to uncover, a lot of the disparities that exist. So now we can't even talk about these disparities, right? So there has to be an overhaul. Like I said, these Band-Aid policies can't continue anymore. And we as, higher education faculty and researchers, we really have to start connecting our what we're teaching to policy making and policy makers. Our voices really do need to be heard during this moment. Yes, Mijo.
Absolutely. And to build on that a little bit, because, higher ed as an institution or as a system has really been pushing access for so long, right? But we haven't really focused on placement and the career skills. And, I think the initial part is about like the credentialing, right? Degrees versus credentials versus certificates. And how do we fit in people into that ecosystem to figure out what's best? And going back to what everyone's talked about with like systematic racism, we know which students are tracked away from lucrative careers that are, discouraged from maybe studying nursing to become, a nurse's assistant, all these things. But then it's also tied to financial aid and support and advising. And what we see in community colleges is that they're stretched thin and they're the counselors in community colleges are trying to serve, 1,000 to 1, 2,000 to 1, their counseling or their advising ratios. So it's not just one thing. So it's like if really there was like a huge infusion of cash, it could really help with the disparities in advising and support and financial aid. But again, like it's like where do we start? Because it's so layered that to build on like what Dr. Vega was saying is like it's a band-aid. And where's the biggest band-aid that you want to place? Is it on financial aid? Is it on access? Is it on persistence? Is it on career placement? Is it on the credentialing? Even just today, like NPR released that, did a brief about almost 600,000 students have opted out of higher ed this fall and they're primarily low income. They're primarily going to community colleges. So what does that mean for the workforce? And they're saying a lost generation. It's like, I think I'm not sure if that is the best phrase for it, but I think if anything, it's like, how do we get them back? And the Biden-Harris administration is going to have a big push of like, how do you get 500,000 students back into higher ed next academic year? Whether that's ideally that'll be post-COVID fall 2021, but as we've seen, that's still a big question mark on what does that look like? Is that going to be in person, online, hybrid? And I think again that connects to the bigger issues about vaccines, financial aid, support services, resources, everything again. So they have a big push to try to figure out where do they start. So I'm hoping whoever the next, Secretary of Education is, comes in with a clean understanding, a clean and clear understanding, and has a level of empathy to see like who are the students most impacted by these policies in higher ed and how do we fix it, and bring in content experts to really push a conversation of equity to start addressing the hundreds of issues that we're experiencing in higher ed, that students are experiencing in higher ed.
Yeah, I think, Dr. Huerta, you touched on a point that I've been keep hearing a lot in higher education in terms of like, when this COVID is, when we get this COVID under control, then, we can go back to our normal, or where we were at. And I don't want to go back there. And I think that's where, the questions that we have to pose to higher education institutions is that what we left was not working. And this pandemic and what we're seeing in terms of our, the national landscape is revealing to us that, our education system isn't working for many people. And the inequities have been, clearly revealed to us in ways that even ties nutrition and health and wellness to our schooling system and our health. And so to go back is sort of, negating the fact that we need to, reform, we need transformation. To go back is to reify sort of the inequities that we're already experiencing. So if higher education institutions don't take a moment and really reflect about this time and what, in question sort of who is most harmed, who is not, getting nourished, who is most impacted by what we've experienced for the last 9 months. If we don't take time to really just delve into those topics as institutions, we're continue to reify the same inequities that we've been experiencing all this time. So that's my worry too, is that we're not going to reflect upon
how faulty the plan might be is better than that.
I don't know what's going on.
Now, this may stop that crater that we've been discussing.
Sorry, hold on one second.
We're talking about going into, say, an individual household, someone who's very much in need right now, and $600 isn't necessarily going to cut it. I mean, I know you look at a chart, you look at a graph, maybe this turns out not to be as bad as it could have been. But what about those Americans who, they're handed a check, but it isn't enough to get them through?
Well, the check that I agree with you that 600 probably is not going to be enough for a lot of people. But for me,
hold on, we have we're having some technical difficulties.
Can you mute him on the participant side?
And they found that the unemployment insurance plus was a really, really, really big positive support for the consumption of people most in need. And so the thing that I would, if I were there and I were arguing, and I know that we got to get a bill passed as probably you can at everything one, I would make the unemployment insurance plus up bigger. Because those are the people who need the thing the most. And there's a sign that about 85%.
Hey, Raul. Garcia.
Yes, hola, hola. ¿Qué
Hey,
es lo que está pasando?
Can you mute yourself, please?
¿Cómo dices?
Can you hit mute on your microphone, please? Because we can hear your TV.
Está puesto el micrófono.
Sí, si lo puedo apagar, por favor. ¿Puede
Okay,
apagar el micrófono? Es que
Estamos grabando ahorita.
mucho.
Ok. No sé dónde. Ah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Ron and Kevin, thank you so much for your insights there. So what did the president do today to help the state?
¿Ya?
What did he do today about the deadly
No, siempre le podemos oír, escuchar.
disappearing act?
¿Y cómo lo apago?
Many in the Trump administration pushed further than
Edwin, if you're host
Yeah.
of this meeting, you can mute them.
No, actually, I can't because I'm not the host. Or the USALA is the host right now, so I apologize, everyone. Hold on one second.
Related to Raul's TV commentary, I do agree that the 600 or the 1200 isn't enough, though, for people. So if that's connected to higher ed too, I would say that that's a critical thing.
Can we?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing is that I think that a lot of this is connected to higher education, but we've done a really fantastic job in the United States to make it sound that higher education is for the elite, and it has been, right? That's actually what it was structured for. And so having that kind of ideology to then, then impose on folks, come from low income backgrounds, like this is, if you work hard, you're gonna be able to reach that, but then your family's only getting $600 to $1,200 for this pandemic. I mean, how am I going to pay my bills? Like that's not. It's just that's what I'm saying. It's like these band-aid policies that continue that is going to affect us. We're going to hear about this in our classrooms. We're going to hear about this amongst faculty with kids. You know what I mean? Like $1,200 doesn't cover, it doesn't cover my mortgage. It doesn't cover my daycare rent. And so, and that's real, right? And so, we have to, I think, be more able, and this is why I love that Dr. Mayorga brought us all together, because I think we're so disconnected, I think, as higher education researchers, from the policy world. Some of us, we have to do a better job, I think, at being more public, at being at working at our public intellectualism, our public information spreading. Like we have to get better at that to ensure and let folks know that there is a big connection, whether you attend higher education or not, between how you are, how this government is treating you and what your chances are in the future.
I want to just go back to Edwin's question for a second, by way of an anecdote. When I start my classes with higher ed professionals or students wanting to enter higher ed, I bring up a story about Martin Luther King right before he was assassinated. He's conversing with Belafonte, and King is a bit despondent, and Belafonte's like, Martin, what's wrong? And Martin says, I'm afraid that I'm integrating my people into a burning house. And I often think about this in higher education. We focus, as Adrian mentioned, on access and inclusion, but are we integrating into a burning house? Is the university integrating people into a burning house, i.e. American society writ large? These are questions that I don't have an answer to, and sometimes it might be said, and I think there's a legit question about this. I'm speaking from a position of privilege about this, so on and so forth. So I think that needs to be considered. But at the same time, I think it's a valid question. And regards to this, I do want to come back to what Blanca said about the Band-Aids. I do think this conversation would be completely different if we had debt abolition and publicly funded higher education. But not just publicly funded higher education, but what some of my colleagues, Andrew Ross and Hannah Appel, say, reparative public higher education, i.e. publicly funded higher education that seeks to repair hundreds of years of colonialism, patriarchy, racism, imperialism, we go down the line, because we know that the university has been complicit in many of these practices. And so there's a question about not only fighting for public higher education, fully funded, but also trying to transform the university into a reparative place. Whether or not that's possible in their Biden administration, I highly doubt it, but we can perhaps amplify the pressure.
So I'm curious, what then is, so let's just speak practically about this. We're coming into a new administration. There are many more questions than there are answers. From your individual perspectives and the work that you're doing, I think we've already heard from Dr. Wozniak around debt abolition and a kind of reparative abolitionist work. What are some other aspects of this kind of larger higher education landscape that need attending to, understanding that they're all connected to one another, but are there particular aspects of it that you think that we really need to kind of focus in on, zero in on in these early aspects of this new, the early phases of this new administration?
Edwin, can I just add one thing to that really quickly? Like day one,
Please.
Biden and the Secretary of Education could use something called compromise and settlement to abolish all federal student debt. The question is, will they do it? And that's what the
Could you say a little more about that, Jason, as to
Sure.
what you mean by that?
Yeah, so it's a legal loophole that some lawyers discovered that it basically, I don't want to get into the jargon, but long and short of it is the Secretary of Education, authorized by Joe Biden or whoever's president, can write off debt. This is constitutional. Now, the Republicans will more than likely challenge this if it happens. Fine, let them challenge it, because when they challenge things like this, they challenge healthcare, they lose, right? Like it's a bad look for them. So let's cancel it, let them challenge it. But they could literally, with this signing off of a pen, write off the debt. Now, why they're so resistant to write that off, I think is worthy of discussion. They keep playing means-tested games that we at the Debt Collective strongly disagree with. And the pressure is that we're trying to put on is like, cancel this now. I think people here already brought up the benefits of that. Not only for our students who are exhausted, they're exhausted because they have to work so many jobs because they don't want to go into debt. They're studying stuff they don't want to be studying because they need the return on investment logic, which debt intensifies. So I think this has enormous implications. It's something that Biden, if he has political courage, can do from day one. The question is, will he do it? And right now it looks like he won't.
And if I can add really quick, because something that I think we haven't really talked enough about in this forum or even in higher ed in general is the number of students that have debt with no degree. So how do we, so with this, possible debt reduction or, like erasing the debt, that could be transformative for thousands and thousands and thousands of lives across the US. So then how does how does the Biden-Harris administration remotivate or incentivize those individuals that have 45 units or 60 units or whatever to get them their credentials or their certificates and back into the higher ed pipeline? But it's two-pronged, because we could get them back into higher ed, but are they going to carry on or be afraid of more debt to get that BA or master's or whatnot? And so that's something for us to consider. To jump back a little bit about what should be a central focus, I would say prison education programs. I think the focus on individuals that are incarcerated or previously incarcerated and making sure that they have access to higher ed is not just an individual benefit, but a community benefit to provide the tools and skills that they need in order to have mobility. And I think that's something that, state by state, every effort, there is no central typology of the best practices at work, but we know that individuals with a college education are less likely to re-engage in criminal acts. So if that's a possible huge cost savings, I think that should be a focus on getting individuals to earn some type of degree, certificate, credential, so they can have, you know, again, that stability. But we have to figure out who pays for it, ensure that individuals don't have crazy amount of debt, but then other also connected to state policies related to reentry programs, because there's a huge focus on working versus education. So it's not just going to be a higher ed issue, it has to be a corrections issue to figure out and to work and calibrate probation officers to ensure that they promote higher ed as a viable option versus employment at, you know, a Subway or at a gas station, which, you know, I'm not demeaning those positions, but it's like if the individual says, I want to get a degree in this thing so I can, you know, whatever it is, like, how do we promote that? How do we support that?
And I think it has to be a collective effort as well. You know, as somebody who has worked with these policies, who have, you know, or practices that higher education has engaged in, to let students leave the institution with a lot of debt. You know, it's also institutional responsibility. I mean, all it takes is for a few of us to know that this is going on, to then, you know, do some really critical work with within our institutions, to work with our students to ensure that that does not happen. And I'm not just talking about financial literacy. I'm literally, you know, meaning like, you know, talking with students, making sure that, you know, that is this the school for them? Too many institutions have, you know, this marketing, you know, strategy of getting students in, particularly the ones who are tuition based, no matter what their interest is. You may not be the perfect match for the student, but as long as you got the student in, you're gonna be fine. And what ends up happening is, as Adrian said, we have these students who then leave the institution. No one hears anything about them afterward, or you help provide them with some work and counseling to make sure that they know what they're getting themselves into, or help them get out before it's too late. It's the Biden administration, seriously, Biden-Harris administration could use more higher education professionals. And I'm not just talking about researchers, I'm talking about practitioners who have been in the field, who have actually influenced practices and policies, to let them know that this isn't just a federal government issue, but it's a collective effort between the higher education institutions, and our federal government and our states too. These are big state issues that need to be addressed. And unless we're at that table or we start creating them, we're going to have this conversation in 4 years.
I think I would add to that in terms of, from my vantage point, what I've been doing for the last decade is, working with and for undocumented and DACA students. And we need to stop making DACA people and individuals political pawns, and provide a pathway to citizenship for these individuals and their parents and families, because this is a segment of the population that doesn't have any student debt because they can't access any of the federal loans, right? And if you can just imagine for a minute what it takes to hustle $50,000 for a semester, for a year of a college education, being without legal status, but also having to hustle sort of other means of economic support, not only for themselves, but for their families. And so the other thing that I will say that is kind of an intersection of this issue is the deportation machine that we currently have, that was, in the last 4 years, we've seen it, right? We've seen the things that are happening on the border in ways, we've seen the family separations. We know that we have traumatized a whole generation of immigrant children, that was state sanctioned and nationally sanctioned by our government. And I think we need to reconcile with the fact that we need to provide some restoration for that. And immigrants should no longer be pawns, particularly those that have been here most of the majority of their lives and have gotten most of their education here in the United States. We need a pathway to citizenship. It is time to stop making DACA recipients, because DACA is not enough. It is one of its band-aids that Dr. Vega talked about. It is beneficial, but it doesn't necessarily provide sort of a sustained livelihood for many people. And so we really just need to stop making immigrants political pawns in our educational system.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Munoz, for saying that, because, you know, the trauma that then, you know, again, as educators, that now educators will have to work with, right? That we're not going to be trained to do. A lot of the work that, you know, that I've done in getting students, undocumented students into college, you know, shows that that administrators and counselors are not prepared to work with these individuals, and not because they don't want to, right? A lot of them simply just are not provided that training, you know, and that's a huge deal. SB 1070 in Arizona was not, you know, is nowhere near, I would say, the trauma that, you know, these children have faced within the Trump administration or in the Obama administration. But what I would say is that now there's data that those young people who have lived under that SB 1070 rule in Arizona, you know, became very active in their communities, whether to vote themselves or to get others to vote. And we saw how Arizona, you know, then switched over to blue. And again, not because they necessarily wanted a Biden-Harris administration, but because those young people were sick of it, right? These are the children of, you know, of you know, what they saw that policy occurring, you know, to their families and their friends. And we're going to have another generation just like that, who are not going to be satisfied with the bandages that we've been experiencing in policymaking.
So, I mean, it's interesting to think about the tensions here. One of, are we potentially integrating our young people into a burning house? And two, that even if we do integrate them into this burning house, that there are, I think, as each of you have pointed to, different types of practices that are disappearing our young people, rather than, you know, I think earlier Adrian pointed to this idea of a lost generation, but it seems to me it's actually one of disappearance rather than they being lost. We have disappeared them and are continuing to disappear them, which is astounding and crushing all at the same time to see this happen. And so in the time we have, I wanted to turn to thinking a little bit about one, there's a search for an education secretary happening. I'm curious as to what kinds of who we might be thinking about, or what kinds of leadership skills and vision do we need right now so that we disrupt this process of disappearance. And two, what are some practical strategies that we need to think about, including, you know, canceling the debt, with regards to making higher education not something that is not only livable, but something that actually is generative and nourishes our young people to be, as young people say, right, their best selves. But I wanted to start first with the administrative kind of leadership question. Where are we? Who do we need? What kind of vision do we need out there to really transform this thing?
I guess I could say, or Adrian, go for it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I was gonna suggest hopefully someone that was educated at a public university or a minority serving institution that at least has a credential or experience from those types of institutions. Because I think, you know, what I mentioned earlier about increased empathy and understanding is that you need people that, you know, building on what Blanca said, like, that understand, that really can like understand the populations that are connected. Because if we just go with the traditional Ivy League institution, you know, like limited work experience in the field, then how will they be able to really understand the connection between like policy and practice? So I think those are some central things that we really need to work on but I think wholeheartedly that we need someone that is really equity focused and is going to be able to push the conversation forward and really hopefully break barriers, because we've talked about so many band-aids that we've seen over the last 30, 40 years. Like, who's going to be that person that's going to be transformative, that really can really help whatever populations that we're talking about, whether it's DACA kids, whether it's student parents, whether it's formerly or currently incarcerated. Like, there's all these populations that need support. So how do they create policies that speak to, you know, the subgroups, but then also to institutions largely? Because there's been a lot of conversations about, you know, why do higher ed, you know, and Jason really brought this up, like, how do we push higher ed institutions to use maybe some fractions of their endowment, right? Instead of paying creditors, like, you know, how can we really start doing innovative reforms to push the conversation forward? Because if anything, we've seen with faculty being laid off, with students dropping out, or, you know, higher attrition rates, all these things, like, you know, even if they gave us a couple $2 billion, which is still a crazy amount of money, but how do you help 4,000 or 5,000 institutions across the country? You know, like, and how do you really target the institutions that need the biggest push, right? Because, and if that's connected to tax reform, or if that's connected to other things, like, how do we do it? Because, you know, even yesterday, what did we see? Like, people were celebrating that billionaires were donating money, but it's like, if they were taxed in the first place, then those institutions would have received the money, you know, in one way or another. Or, you know, if we think about Amazon commercials, right? Amazon does all these amazing things. And then in the back of your mind, it's like, well, if they paid taxes, wouldn't those things be happening already? So it's like, again, like, it's connected again to these bigger ecosystems of change. And it's like, how much do we want to push? And will that person be a real catalyst? I don't know. Now I'm going off on a tangent. I'm going to step back.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said, Adrian, about the taxes. I mean, we know the tax revolts that happened, you know, in the Reagan years in California were highly racialized, and they gutted higher education funding and public school funding, K through 12. So that's huge. No, but this question is a good one, and I'm reminded of I had the good fortune of spending a little bit of time in Chiapas, Mexico, with the Zapatistas, and while I was there, I heard a phrase, something along the lines of, you can remove the person from the chair, but the chair remains. And so I think it's really important to think, obviously it matters who gets appointed, but I think it's also really important to think about these structural issues and what can a Secretary of Education really do in the current structure. That said, if I had my choice, I was thinking about this question last night, and I didn't really have like one specific person, but it would be really nice to have like the social justice bargaining for the common good unions that we know of in Chicago, Los Angeles, Oakland, other places, Philadelphia, here in the Wheat Caucus. You know, it'd be amazing if they had the decision-making process. You know, if they could be included in the discussion of who's going to be chosen, that would be fantastic. But we're not there, so we're probably not going to get anything close to that. And it's going to be on us to keep the pressure on to make sure that they push a people's agenda.
I think when I looked at this question, I was, you know, thinking about, you know, sort of like the bar is a little bit low. It has been low for the last 4 years. And so who we get, I think it's going to be a breath of fresh air. But I think one of the things that I have been missing is someone who really understands what it means to be in the trenches as an educator, right? What does it mean to be inside a classroom? What does it mean to be in an under-resourced school? What does it mean? And so someone that has sort of that field knowledge and experience, but also brings a criticality to this, an understanding of how racism plays a role, how food insecurities play a role in our schooling, how mental wellness plays a role. And so I know I'm like, have this big wish list of like, you know, I would like this person to be this and this and this and this and this. But I think if we really are interested in transforming education and higher education in particular, we really need to have someone who has been in the trenches, has worked in, you know, Dr. Vega's seat as a financial aid director, has, you know, talked to students, has talked to families and communities, and knows how to work with that. So I think what I've been missing, you know, in many of the secretaries of education that we've seen over the last decades is that lack of practical and critical experiences that I think could be transformative.
Yeah, I agree with all my colleagues here. And you know, I want somebody to, you know, there's a lot of solutions that for years we've been offering. This shouldn't be hard, right? It's like when, you know, folks are like up in arms about, you know, what are we gonna do now? And, you know, when it comes to racism, when it comes to, you know, folks, you know, who are undocumented, and it's just like, yo, we've been writing about this for a long time. Like, why are you looking elsewhere? You know what I mean? We have the answers for you. I want somebody who's willing to take those answers, run with them, right? You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's somebody who, you know, like Dr. Munoz says, like somebody who has been in these seats and gets it, you know, can say, I've done this at the practical level and I've done research. You know, I want somebody who is able to understand that Black students, Black faculty, Black administrators continue to be our miner's canary. You know, they continue to, every time I see more and more data, whether it's, you know, data like Dr. Nicholas Vargas, I think he's at the University of Florida, you know, where he found that the HSIs, the Hispanic Serving Institutions that are most likely to get the Title V grants are the ones with the largest white enrollments and the smallest Black enrollments. The Latino and the Asian enrollments were negligible. But that's a disparity that we see, whether you're an HSI, whether you're a predominantly white institution. You know, why does this keep happening? You know what I mean? Why are we have the answers, right? We see what's happening. We've been writing about it, but you know, folks, you know, Jason has a whole like center, right? Talking about organization, talking about like debt abolition. Like, I just want somebody to be able to take those answers, run with them, say, you know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We don't need another think tank. There's years of research that have been done right here, and we just gotta be smart enough to use that.
Can I say something about this? Because Blanca's brought up on several occasions, like the collective, right? And Edwin asked about what do we do? Like, what are the practicalities? And I do think there's a question about like, how do we build power? Because as you mentioned, several of you have mentioned now, like we know what needs to be done. And people know what needs to be done. We've published enough. Like, I'm sorry, I know we're academics and we love to publish and we get our stuff out there, but like we publish enough. We know what needs to be done. Okay, so how do we build power? Like collective power? Because I think one of the problems is this wishful thinking that, you know, we're gonna push Biden left or they're gonna give us what we need out of the goodness of their hearts. No, man, we gotta take it. Like if we can't build power, then I'm sorry, we're not gonna get what we want. And you know, a good example of this, I really just, again, I'm calling myself out in this. I'm an academic, I'm in a university, and I wanna ask, especially of tenure track people, where are you on the student debt fight? Your students pay your salary through their debt. So you gotta join us. Like you need to fight for them, you need to fight for higher ed, and the way to do that is you get involved in struggles that have direct impacts on all the people that we're talking about here. So again, like how do we build power around this? And what are the practical steps of that? That's another hour-long conversation, but yeah.
And for ourselves, you don't want to know how big my debt is. My debt is huge. So I decided to go to Columbia University.
And we're trying to send our kids to college now with our current debt. So I'm still paying off my student loans and trying to send my kid to college. And so so this is sort of like we're in this limbo stage.
I mean, I think, you know, it really is, it's the tried and true story of life over debt is ultimately the rallying cry, and what the fight is, I think is what's become clear in our conversation here. And I agree, Jason. I think it is about building power and organizing and a lot of political education. I think, you know, even myself included in this conversation as a tenure track, you know, or a tenured, you know, professor is understanding and looking at my students and seeing just the ways in which, you know, seeing both my students, but also seeing my colleagues, and how we have been gaslit to behave and think a certain way about our education, our profession, our work, and we then turnkey that into our students' like lived experiences, their bodies, their thinking, and we just become very much instrumental to the reproduction of a very violent kind of burning house, as you had said earlier, as you alluded to earlier, Jason. And so, you know, in the limited time that we have here, I'm wondering, where do we find hope? Where do we begin with building power? And what kinds of pressure, perhaps tactics or strategies, can we or should we be doing? You know, building off of, I think, some of the things that Jason had pointed out, with regards to putting pressure on the new administration to at the very least, I think, create some space for these conversations, for this research that has already been written, to get the air time that I think it deserves in order for us to even marginally move the needle in a direction that will make things more humane, and actually nourish our students rather than continue to crush them.
I think
So
Jason, yeah, I think Jason mentioned, you know, he said this in just like 30 seconds ago when he said, where are you, right? We have to join groups. We have to join organizations. Maybe we're not the ones to lead these projects, and that's cool. Like, we don't all have to be the first lead on an article. We don't all have to, you know, be the ones to get that Spencer, you know, fellowship. Like, we have to start joining movements that are already in place. Dr. Munoz has been doing years of work on undocumented students, right? And you know, it's good to hear that you know, Adriana is doing work with, you know, with prison reform and you know, connecting that to higher education. You know, and then we also have to connect with media folks. I love the fact that Dr. Mayorga is doing this kind of work, right? Without that vital, you know, space, you know, if we're not building collectives, we can't achieve power. But things are already out there that we can join, that we can, you know, work with our students. Our students need more community engagement work, right? Work with a small organization in your, you know, in your community that's doing work with undocumented students. Work with a small organization that's, you know, against police brutality. You know, these are small, people think that they're small, but they lead to bigger things. And you know, can you imagine if all of us even suggested, you know, that, you know, even today, like a snow day, like, no, we're not going to work. Can you imagine, you know, if we all decided that, like, who's going to say no, right? Like, you know, we have to get all on the same page. And it doesn't have to necessarily be, you know, all necessarily the exact same thing, but we got to join up these movements that are already happening.
Exactly. Because, you know, I think that really like goes back to like activism, and like, what is your activism going to look like? Because, you know, for us, just say collectively, we're like, let's start another nonprofit that does X, Y, and Z. But it's like, if someone's already been doing that for 25 years, then like, really, we're just taking away the limited dollars that are out there for nonprofits that are doing the work, whether that's racial, like, you know, racial equity work or whatnot. But I think this comment also goes to like bigger issues too, right? And about, you know, for myself being tenure track, what does activism and community engagement mean at this type of institution versus this type of institution, right? So I could release 10 policy briefs, you know, about all these different topics, but I'm not sure it would be valued the same way for tenure promotion at my institution versus another institution. So if we're really trying to change things in our community, locally, globally, regionally, you know, however we want to structure it, then it's bigger questions on the institution of like, how much is it worth? You know, for me to be, you know, a part of a state commission on this, you know, related to prison education or to youth that are incarcerated or, you know, whatever, like how many brownie points will I get for tenure and promotion each year? So I think those are bigger issues that we need to think about as you know, higher ed community, or as like through the various associations, like how will we push the conversation forward about like making change? Because if anything we've noticed this year and last year, like, is that there's so many things that are happening, but often we're on the sidelines just saying like, well, that's wrong. And then it's like, but I need to go back to writing, or I need to go back to this grant, or I need to go back to taking care of my kids, or, whatever it is. Like, so how do we push multi-layered reform across the communities? Because it needs to happen, right? Like, we can't just like sit back and just be like, man, that sucks. Like, like, what do we do? And, something that I've done over the last couple of years is like connecting with nonprofits, like, hey, here's a paper, let me talk to you about it. Like, let me share it with you, because most of the time it's stuck behind a paywall. So it's like, how do you get the work that you're doing, whether it's on undocumented students, whether it's about financial aid, whether it's about debt, how do we get the work into the hands of people that can carry it to, people that will listen and can act on it and institute change, right? Because I'm not sure who all the critical players are in LA County or throughout the state that are doing all the things, because there's things popping up on a regular basis related to, whether it's school to prison pipeline or gang associated youth or prison education. There's so many good things happening. So it's like, how do you get the research in the hands of people that can make an immediate difference? And, talk to probation officers or talk to whoever about like fixing it, because ultimately we need to fix these things, because if not, then it'll just be another generation of us looking back like, man, we could have done so much. We could have made this change or this change if people would have read our paper instead of commissioning 10 new papers about that topic.
We have just a couple minutes, so or maybe just a 1 minute. So maybe this is just kind of everyone's last kind of point. So Adriana, I hope that's okay that was your last point, which was a good one. So thank you. Yeah, Jason, did you have a final point?
Yeah, really quickly. 3 practical steps. First off, I want to say I get inspired by you all. Edwin, I heard about you when I was in grad school. So like, you've been at it for a while. So thank you, man.
You can spread those rumors. Continue to spread those rumors. Thank you.
They're not rumors, they're true. So bravo. Real quick, join the Debt Collective. We are forming the nation's first debtors union. We have chapters across the country, including in Los Angeles, including in New York, including, I think we're starting one in Colorado and in Philadelphia, but all over. So debtcollective.org, join the Debt Collective. We have a campaign, the Biden 100, that is demanding Biden to abolish all student debt in the first 100 days. Those are 2 practical steps. And if you're in higher education, there's a really good group organized by Labor Notes called Public Higher Education Workers, FEW. Come to our meetings every Friday, 3 p.m. It has union folks, activist folks in higher ed from across the country that we meet every Friday at 3 o'clock. So we'd love to connect with you on that. And thank you once again. It's been a pleasure learning from all of you.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Munoz, did you have a closing thought? And Dr. Vega?
Just, you asked sort of where is the hope? Where do we find hope? And I find hope in student activists. I hope that is where my hope is. And I hate the fact that they're paying tuition to fix our institutions. But I think more administrators, more faculty members need to be in solidarity with our student activists on our campuses and listen to them and believe them. So that's my last word. Thank you.
Dr. Vega?
I find critical hope in our elders and in our ancestors, in the knowledge that, our folks have been in crisis for a long time before the Trump administration. And there's still people on the ground doing the work, and we got to follow those people who are on the ground doing the work. And for folks who are amplifying, like you, Dr. Mayorga, thank you for amplifying those voices.
Well, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank my guests, Dr. Adrian Huerta, Dr. Jason Wozniak, Dr. Blanca Y. Vega, and Dr. Susana Munoz for joining us today on Encuentros Políticos, Political Encounters on USALA Media. I also want to thank our engineer, Diego, for helping us today. If you have comments or questions about the show, you can find me on Twitter at EIMayorga or email at edwin.mayorga@gmail.com. You can join us as a podcast on Sundays from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern on usalamedia.com, and later you can find these episodes on Spreaker. And for these live streams, you can also find it on our YouTube channel at USALA. Just look up USALA Media. Thank you all. Pa'lante. All right. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Sure.
And I will follow up with everyone once all the show and things go up. So, and my apologies again for the technical difficulties that we had midway through.
I want to hear
was
the
like,
tea on that.
I was like, what
wanna-
is that?
I
Who
want
was
to know
that?
who those folks are. Can you send
Yeah.
us the tea on that on the next email? Like, that's what I want to know. And Jason, I'm a link up with you because I need for you to come talk to my students next semester.
I would love to talk to all of you, and I was actually going to ask for all your, I think I have all your emails, but I would love
Yeah.
to have you talk to my students in this higher ed program that we have at Westchester. It'd be amazing. We have a race, class, and gender series, and it'd be really good to have you
nice.
all on there. Edward knows
Yeah.
on your one, so I really want to be in touch with you all. It was super inspiring.
Likewise.
Thank you for all your work, everyone.
Likewise.
thank you all,
likewise.
everyone.
Thank you.
Please
Thank
stay
you.
healthy,
Appreciate the
and
opportunity.
we'll be in touch soon.
All
Bye-bye.
right.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.